carbon, the phosphorus, the potassium, the nitrogen, etc. They travel from the soil to different components in an ecosystem. When you study the composition of living organisms, carbon constitutes 49% of the dry weight of organism. Heavy usage of vehicles and burning of forest and all that also leads to carbon accumulation in the atmosphere. Hello everyone, a warm welcome to the last session of chapter 14 of 2nd PUC, that is ecosystem. I am Dr. Divya, biology faculty, Vidhyaashram Pre-University College, Mysuru, Temple of Excellence. So in the previous session, we had discussed about one of the components of the ecosystem, that is energy flow, wherein we learnt about the ecological pyramid and we learnt about ecological succession. In today's session, let us discuss about the last component of ecosystem, that is nutrient cycling. So let's learn what nutrient cycling is and then move on to the two important nutrient cycling, that is the carbon cycle and phosphorus cycle. So nutrient cycling is nothing but the amount of nutrients such as carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, etc. that is present in the soil at a given period of time is referred to as the standing state. So in nutrient cycling, we need to learn about the nutrients. So there are different nutrients that are present in the soil, right? There is phosphorus, the nitrogen, the potassium, then the carbon, all these that are dissolved in the soil or present in the soil, they need to be supplied to the plants. And that particular process is explained through nutrient cycling. But these nutrients that are there in the soil at a particular given period of time, it is called as the standing state. If you remember, while talking in the previous session in ecosystem, we had learnt about standing crops, right? While talking about various trophic levels, there was a term called as standing crops. So what was standing crops there? So at a given period of time, how much organisms are there at each trophic level? That will be the standing crop at that particular trophic level, right? Just like that, here also in nutrient cycling, during nutrient cycling, how much amount of nutrients is present in the soil, that will be the standing state of the nutrients. And this standing state of the nutrients varies in different kinds of ecosystem, and not just that, it is also a seasonal basis, because sometimes the composition of the amount of carbon might be more, sometimes phosphorus might occupy a major position. So depending on the environmental conditions or depending on the type of the ecosystem and also depending on the season or the environment, standing state in a nutrient cycle tends to vary. And the movement of nutrient elements through the various components of an ecosystem is called as nutrient cycling. So from the soil, in the soil there are different components of nutrients which are nothing but the carbon, the phosphorus, the potassium, the nitrogen, etc. They travel from the soil to different components in an ecosystem. And this movement is called as movement of the nutrients to different components in an ecosystem is called as nutrient cycling. There is another term for nutrient cycling which is also called as biogeochemical cycle. So here bio means living. So living organisms are present, therefore the term bio, and geo meaning rocks, air and water are involved. So that is why geo, and chemical nothing but carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, etc. The nutrients which are nothing but the chemicals are involved. Therefore, it is also called as biogeochemical cycles. And it is a cycle because there is an interdependency between all these different organisms in a nutrient cycle. And nutrient cycles are mainly of two types. One is gaseous nutrient cycle and the other one is sedimentary nutrient cycle. So gaseous nutrient cycle means some of the compounds that are utilized from the air, that for example carbon. Carbon is a gaseous nutrient cycle. And when talking about phosphorus, potassium and all, they are absorbed from the soil. Therefore, it will be the sedimentary nutrient cycle. So let us study about these in detail. So the reservoir for gaseous type of nutrient cycle, for example, which are having nitrogen, carbon, etc., nitrogen cycle, carbon cycle, etc., exist in the atmosphere, and the sedimentary cycle, as I told you, example, sulfur, phosphorus cycle, etc., they are located in the Earth's crust. So, those present in the atmosphere come under the gaseous cycle. Those present in the Earth's crust come under the sedimentary cycle. So, environmental factors, for example, soil, moisture, the pH, the temperature, etc. These are the ones that regulate or maintain or decide how much amount of nutrients should be released into the atmosphere. So, therefore, the rate of release of nutrients to the atmosphere depends on the environmental factors such as the soil, moisture, pH, temperature, etc. And the function of the reservoir is to meet with the deficit which occurs due to imbalance in the rate of influx and efflux. So, sometimes what happens, the atmosphere might not provide enough amount of nutrients that is needed for nutrient cycling. That time the sedimentary nutrient cycle comes into action. So, that is how both are interdependent on one another. So, let us study about the different nutrient cycling, wherein especially in your PU textbook, they have given two important nutrient cycling. One is the carbon cycle and the other one is phosphorus cycle. So, we shall concentrate on that alone. First, learning about the carbon cycle. So, when you study the composition of living organisms, carbon constitutes 49% of the dry weight of organism, and the most of it is occupied by water. Majority of the organism's body is occupied by water, out of which 49% is occupied by the carbon itself. And if we look at the total quantity of global carbon, we find that 71% of carbon is found dissolved in ocean. So, therefore, oceans are also one of the major sources of carbon here. So, this oceanic reservoir regulates the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as well. So, when we learn it in the form of cycle, you will easily understand again. So, first let us talk about the fossil fuel, which is one of the solid reservoir of carbon. So, fossil fuel also represents a reservoir of carbon, and carbon cycling occurs through atmosphere. It can occur through the atmosphere, it can occur through the ocean, because 71% of the ocean is filled with carbon. So, it can occur through atmosphere, ocean, and also it can occur through living and dead organism. Why? Because when the organisms die, their body is made up of around 41% of carbon, right? So, that will enter into the soil. So, that will be utilized by the plants as well. So, therefore, the atmosphere, ocean and the living or the dead organisms also contribute to the carbon content in the nature. And according to one estimate, it is said that 4 into 10 to the power 13 kg of carbon is fixed annually in the biosphere through photosynthesis. So, plants, carbon is one of the carbon in the form of carbon dioxide is one of the main raw materials for photosynthesis in plants, and therefore, plants utilize about 4 into 10 to the power 13 kg of carbon in order to photosynthesize, that is globally. And a considerable amount of carbon returns to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide during the process of respiratory activity of the producers and consumers. So, we all know that carbon dioxide is utilized by the plants during the process of photosynthesis, while during the process of respiration, the same carbon dioxide is given out to the atmosphere. And we animals also, we utilize oxygen and we give out carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and this is also how the carbon source accumulates in the atmosphere. So, here you can see one of the main components of carbon is the fossil fuels, right? So, the fossil fuels like burning of forest, fuel wood and the organic debris, then the combustion of fossil fuels for vehicle. So, when combustion occurs in the vehicle, that is when heat is generated during the use of petrol for the vehicle to move forward, at that time also a lot of carbon is released to the atmosphere, and these and all are in the form of carbon dioxide, it is released to the atmosphere, and this in turn is used by the plants during the process of photosynthesis. So decomposers also contribute to the carbon dioxide pool by the processing of waste materials and dead organic matters of land or ocean. So here these decomposers, they feed on the dead and decaying organic matter. So in the dead and decaying organic matter also carbon is present. Therefore, they also contribute to increasing the sedimentary carbon, that is carbon in the terrestrial environment, and some amount of the fixed carbon is lost to sediments and removed from circulation. So here also, what are the different sources of carbon? Let's look into. So first source is when we burn the forest fuel wood and also the organic debris that are there in the forest, that time also carbon dioxide enters into the atmosphere. So when carbon dioxide enters to the atmosphere means we are adding carbon to the atmosphere, right? So here also, when the burning of fossil fuels for vehicles, that is combustion of fossil fuels for vehicles and electricity and heat and all is there, at that time also the carbon gets added to the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. Next, here also oil and gas, these also coal, they also add on to the carbon content in the atmosphere. And not just that, here these carbon will be utilized by the plants. They will be utilized by the plants during the process of photosynthesis. So when they are utilized by the plants during the process of photosynthesis, and apart from that, now inside the body, what is the carbon content is there. When these plants die and decay, or these animals will feed on these plants. So when these animals and the plants also die and decay, what happens? It will enter into the soil. Why? Because of the action of the detritus, that is those organisms which decompose or break down the inorganic material into smaller fragments. So at that time also they will lead to carbon deposition, that is in the soil. So carbon deposition is also there in the form of coal in the soil, and also in the form of limestone and dolomite also it is there in the soil. So likewise different sources of carbon are there, and also oceans also has 71% of carbon, therefore that is also being utilized. Next, burning of wood. So as I told you, burning of wood, forest fire and combustion of organic matter, fossil fuel, and during volcanic eruptions also additional carbon dioxide is released to the atmosphere. And human activities also have quite a significant role in the carbon cycle, because the heavy usage of vehicles and burning of forest and all that also leads to carbon accumulation in the atmosphere. And also the rapid deforestation or cutting of trees and the intensive burning of fossil fuels for energy, and also the transportation, that is the usage of vehicles, have significantly increased, or it has drastically increased the rate of release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So this is how they will be utilized, and each of these are interdependent on one another. So next, let's look into the phosphorus cycle. So phosphorus is a major constituent of the biological membranes. So the cell membrane, they are made up of phosphorus. The nucleic acid, we all know that the backbone of DNA is nothing but made up of phosphates, and the cellular energy transfer systems, all these contain phosphorus in them. ATPs, adenosine triphosphates, they contain phosphorus. So much amount of phosphorus is present in the living organisms in their cells, right? So many animals also need large quantities of phosphorus in order to make shells. So the shells of animals, that is the mollusks and all that, they contain lot of phosphorus. The bones contain lot of phosphorus. Teeth also contain lot of phosphorus. So where and all phosphorus availability is there? In the entire plant and animal body, phosphorus availability is there. On the cell membrane, phosphorus availability is there. In the DNA, the phosphorus availability is there. And during various metabolic process occurring in the body, for all that energy is required in the form of ATP. That ATP, nothing but it also contains phosphorus. Next, the shells of various animals contain phosphorus, the bones and teeth also contain phosphorus. So, the natural reserve, apart from that, the natural reservoir of phosphorus is rock. Rocks also contain a lot of phosphorus in the form of phosphates. Rock contain a lot of phosphates, and these rocks, when they wither, during the weathering of rocks, minute amounts or small quantities of these phosphates, they dissolve in soil solution and therefore they are absorbed by the roots of the plant. Not just that, when all these animals die and decay, whatever phosphorus is there in the shells, bones, teeth and all that will, and not just that, in the cell whatever phosphorus content is there, that will enter into the soil and therefore it will be utilized by the plant. So, that is how phosphorus is utilized by the plants. Carbon, what were the different sources and how they are utilized by the plants we have seen. Now, I am talking about phosphorus. So, here you can see we have the consumers. So, what are the consumers? They are the herbivores. They can be the herbivores are the consumers. Then the carnivores are the consumers, right? We had seen in the previous session wherein we had primary consumers, secondary consumer, tertiary consumers. And what is there in the body of these consumers? Apart from that, producers are nothing but the plants, right? So, the plants also contain DNA. They also have cell. So, the plants will also have phosphorus, right? So, these phosphorus will enter into the animals when they feed on the plants. But apart from that, these consumers will also have phosphorus, where the shells of the consumers, the bones, the teeth and also the cell of the consumers, they will have phosphorus. Now, all this phosphorus will enter into the soil. How it will enter into the soil? The producers, the green plants, they wither, the leaves of the green plants wither, right? So, when they shed their leaf on when the plants die, the phosphorus will enter into the soil. Just like that, when the consumers also die, the phosphorus will enter into the soil, wherein the detritus, that is the decomposers, these organisms will further facilitate decomposition and they will add phosphorus to the soil solution. This phosphorus, some of the amount can run off and some of the amount of phosphorus will be taken by the plants directly. Now, again it will enter into the animals through the producers. So, that is how the phosphorus cycle continues. Not just that, the rocks also contain phosphorus in the form of phosphates, right? These phosphates will also, during the process of weathering or breaking of rocks into smaller bits, it will add on phosphates to the soil solution. Again, here also it will be utilized by the plants. So, this is the soil solution. So, these soil solutions will be further utilized by the plants. So, this is how the phosphorus cycles in the ecosystem. So, herbivores and other animals, I told you, they obtain phosphorus from plants and the waste products. So, when these herbivores and other animals along with the plants, when they die and when they decompose by the detritus, the phosphate solubilizing bacteria, they also release phosphorus. So, not just that, in the soil there are some phosphate solubilizing bacteria which feed on the dead and decaying organic matter and they release large amount of phosphorus to the soil. They are nothing but the detritus. And unlike carbon cycle, here there is no respiratory release of phosphorus. Atmosphere phosphorus is not there. Only sedimentary phosphorus is available. But in carbon cycle, atmosphere carbon as well as sedimentary carbon both were available. Here there is no phosphorus in the atmosphere. Only in the soil phosphorus is there. So, that is one of the major difference between the carbon cycle and the phosphorus cycle. So, this was about the cycling of the phosphorus in the ecosystem. So, the other two major and important differences between carbon and phosphorus cycle are, firstly, atmospheric inputs of phosphorus through rainfall are much smaller than carbon inputs. Why? Because atmosphere does not contain phosphorus to that extent when compared to that of carbon. So, therefore, the carbon coming from the atmosphere to the soil is high quantity when compared to that of phosphorus. And the gaseous exchange of phosphorus between organisms and the environment is not at all there. It is quite negligible. But the gaseous exchange between carbon and the animals to the environment is quite more because we take in oxygen and we give out carbon dioxide. Plants also during respiration they give out carbon dioxide. Only for photosynthesis they take in carbon dioxide. So that is why the gaseous exchange of phosphorus between organisms and environment are negligible. So these are the differences between the phosphorus and the carbon cycle. One thing is phosphorus is only sedimentary, carbon cycle is both gaseous and sedimentary. The other one is phosphorus cycle coming to the soil or earth in the form of rain is negligible, carbon is more. Other one is gaseous exchange between the environment and that is the phosphorus between organism and environment is negligible or not there at all, but carbon cycle is, carbon exchange is more here. So next let's study about one small topic, that is ecosystem services. So we take a lot of things from the ecosystem, right? So what are the different services that are rendered by the ecosystem to the human beings? We shall look into. So healthy ecosystem, they are the base for a wide range of economic, environmental and aesthetic goods and services. They provide a lot of economic value to the society, environmental related values to the society, and not just that, religious related values and goods to the societies as well. So the products of ecosystem process are named as ecosystem services. So what are the different products? Let's look into. Say for example, let's consider a healthy forest ecosystem. So if we have a healthy forest or an ecosystem filled with trees, that is luscious greenery, it will purify the air and also it will purify the water, and also it will reduce the droughts, and also it will reduce the floods because proper seepage of water will occur, and also it will help in cycling the nutrients, and also it will help in making the soil fertile, and also it will be a home for different wildlife, and also it will help in maintaining the biodiversity, and a lot of pollination of crops can occur if the forest environment is good. And not just that, it becomes a source or site for the storage of carbon, and also it provides a lot of goods for aesthetic, that is religious, cultural and spiritual values as well. So though value of such services of ecosystem or biodiversity is difficult to determine, it seems reasonable to think that biodiversity should carry a hefty price tag, right? Does biodiversity put a price tag on the people, or does the environment or ecosystem put a price tag on the people? No, never. How much ever we want, it gives us in the form of goods and services. But what are we giving back to the environment? Are we giving back to the environment in the form of planting a tree? No. So always we have to make it a habit. Whenever we use something from the environment, we need to give it back. Say for example, you're cutting a tree for a particular purpose. Plant a sapling somewhere for that cut tree. So that is how we can give back to the environment. So Robert Constanza and his colleagues, one scientist, Robert Constanza and his colleagues, they have recently tried to put price tags of nature's life support services. So researchers have put an average price tag of $33 trillion a year on these fundamental ecosystem services, which have been largely taken for granted because they are free. So that is why we usually nowadays, earlier whatever trees were there in a plantation crop or something, that could be cut by the owner of that particular plantation. But nowadays we need to pay a price, even though that land belongs to us and the tree there belongs to us, which have been raised by us. But in spite of that, a price is put by the government so that unnecessary cutting of trees will not be done by the respective owner of that particular land. So that is why people have started putting, or the government has started putting price tag for ecosystem services. Otherwise it was very easy, like earlier people would enter to the forest, whatever they want they would do and come back. Nowadays also it is done illegally, but it is quite difficult when compared to earlier times. So this is nearly twice the value of the global gross national product, GNP, that is global gross national product, which is US dollar 18 trillion. So therefore 18 trillion or 33 trillion price tag has been put for the ecosystem services or whatever service we take from the ecosystem. And out of the total cost of various ecosystem services, the soil formation accounts for about 50% and contribution of other services such as recreation. So there is a land and you need to create a park or you need to create a recreation center, then you have to pay a price tag. It is not that, okay, this is a forest, it doesn't belong to anyone. You can go there, cut the trees and do whatever you want. You need to create a building, you need to create a recreation site or whatever. For everything, a price tag has been put nowadays. And the cost of climate regulation and habitat for wildlife are about 6% each. Even for the habitat of the wildlife or for the regulation of the climate, for all that price tags have been put. Because if we don't weigh something with money, then people will not know the value of it. If it is given free to the people, then they will start misusing it. So that is why a price tag has been put for the ecosystem services. So this was about ecosystem services. So with this, the chapter comes to an end. So I hope in this particular session you have understood about the nutrient cycling, which was one of the component of the ecosystem, wherein we learnt about the carbon cycle and the phosphorus cycle, and also we learnt about the ecosystem services. So different services that have been provided by the ecosystem and how it has been made and that is how a price tag has been put to the ecosystem recently. So this was about this particular chapter. We shall meet again in the coming sessions with a new chapter. Thank you.